Joe Biden steps onto the tarmac there in Tel Aviv, and we find out that inflation here in the U.S. has hit 9.1% in June, the highest in 4 decades.
To keep alive the truth and honor of the Holocaust, horror of the Holocaust.
We're going to talk about a bleak inflation report fueling even more economic fears. We're going to break down the numbers. Stay with us. Inflation surged to a 4-decade high in June. A new report from the Labor Department shows that prices jumped by 9.1% from last year and 1.3% from just the month before.
High inflation is being driven by, this perfect storm of COVID, the war in Ukraine, and unprecedented stimulus from Washington. And it means that, paychecks are just not going as far for families, and that is very painful.
And the unrelenting inflation hitting another 40-year high, gas, housing, food. So how do Americans keep up? What's the political impact? We'll hear directly from the White House coming up next.
Okay, so sticker shock is sticking around. A new report shows inflation hitting a 40-year high in June. Inflation in June surged to 9.1%. That marks the biggest year-over-year jump in consumer prices in more than 40 years.
8.8% was the expectation, which, by the way, was higher than the top line number last month. So we were already expecting an acceleration. This came in even hotter than that. It was eye-popping, to say the least. So we talk a lot about gas, understandably. That said, the report, it was broad-based. We saw inflation pretty much across the board.
They have to adjust. These sanctions are extremely expensive politically and financially on NATO and the United States. And thus far, they have made Russia stronger. The ruble's at the highest level it's been in 5 years, and Russia's participation in the global markets, oil markets, is higher than it was before the war, which I would say and they're still in Ukraine. So I just think that you have to think about this question after all this time, especially as it relates to fuel and fertilizer, which is not just inflation. Those sanctions are direct. That is the direct cost.
It has been more than 40 years since inflation was this bad. 40 years. The lead starts right now. Food, gas, rent, electricity, all seeing stunning price increases. Families forced to choose between buying groceries or having enough gas to get to work. The pain is real, and the jaw-dropping numbers today prove it. Welcome to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper. We start today with our money lead and horrible news for your wallet. New data today released by the Biden administration shows inflation surging to 9.1%. That is the highest level in more than 40 years, and it means the prices we pay overall are 9.1% higher than they were at this time last year. So unless you have benefited from an unlikely 10% raise since then, you now have less money in your pocket than you did a year ago. Much of the increase is driven by gas prices, which we should note have fallen in recent weeks, but they remain insanely high, up nearly 60% in this report. And the increases are felt across a range of categories. Prices on groceries are up more than 10%, housing nearly 6%. Today, President Biden admitting that inflation is still, quote, unacceptably high. Vice President Harris saying there is no question we still have work to do. Little consolation to the millions of Americans who are struggling to make ends meet due to rising prices across the board. If you're looking for any good news in today's Consumer Price Index report, well, Jason Furman, a former Obama White House top economic advisor, tweeted, "There is absolutely nothing good in the CPI report." The soaring prices are forcing some Americans to have to make some really brutal decisions, including digging into their savings just to get by. One California resident telling CNN that if she wants to eat, she cannot afford to drive her car. She has to choose.
Inflation in America surged in June, with some of the steepest price hikes from June of last year in places like Baltimore, Miami, Atlanta, Phoenix, and Alaska. The biggest drivers, gasoline up 60% in a year, and groceries up 12%, plus the largest monthly rise in rent since 1986. Consumer sentiment hit a record low last month, as new polling shows 42% of Americans are struggling to remain where they are financially, nearly double from a year ago, and 85% think the economy is getting worse.
Especially after COVID, nobody has money for anything, and now everything goes up higher and higher.
And Jake, by one estimate, the typical American household is now spending nearly $500 more every month on the same goods and services. So even as gas prices dip, families are still eating so many surging costs, and many of them are telling me their salaries just aren't keeping up.